Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Distinguished Speaker presentation. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and members, it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Our guest today is the Honorable R. Nicholas Burns, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and currently Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Politics at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School for Government. The World Affairs Council is a leading forum for global education and international affairs in the Washington, D.C. area and nationwide. In our effort to inform and engage the American public in the major global issues of our day, we bring world leaders, government officials, opinion makers, economists, journalists, corporate leaders, Nobel laureates, and more to our audiences here in Washington, nationally through our weekly television program, World Affairs Today, and worldwide through our on-demand viewing via YouTube, Fora TV, and MHC networks. We have a number of new faces with us today, so I would like to take just a minute to talk about the Council and our programs. In addition to our public speaker programming, the Council works to fill the gap in global education in our nation's schools through programming for high school teachers and middle school teachers to better enable them to bring the world into their classrooms. We work with high school and middle school students to help them acquire a better understanding of the interconnected, multicultural, and competitive world in which they will live and lead. These school programs are entirely funded through tax-deductible contributions to the Council by our members, foundations, corporate sponsors, and the interested public. If you are interested in learning more about how you can support our global education and international affairs programs, please have a look at the brochures located on your tables today. They describe the many ways in which you can become part of the solution. We'd love to have you join our efforts. Now let me introduce to you John Ward. He is Vice President, Corporate Strategy and Business Development Operations for the Lockheed Martin Corporation. He is also a long-serving board member of the World Affairs Council. He will introduce our distinguished speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Ward.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. Mr. Ambassador, distinguished guests, fellow board members and friends of the World Affairs Council and also the World Affairs Councils of America. We're indeed privileged to have with us today Ambassador Nicholas Burns to address the Arab Spring and its implications for U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador Burns is uniquely prepared to address this topic today. His distinguished diplomatic career is well known to most of you, but a few highlights would include Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, during which time he negotiated the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, a crucial agreement with that very strong potential friend in the subcontinent. He's the lead U.S. negotiator on Iran's nuclear weapons program as well. He was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, 2001 to 2005, the U.S. ambassador to Greece, 97 to 2001, and I'm sure a position where he had some really fun times as the State Department spokesman for Warren Christopher and for Madeleine Albright as well. So, is National Security Council 90 to 95 under Presidents H.W. Bush and President Bill Clinton, and of course, way back when, Consul General in Jerusalem. He's currently, as Heidi said, the Professor of Practice of Diplomacy and International Politics at Harvard University. He has a BA from Boston College, an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins, as well as an unbelievable 10 honorary doctorates from 8 different universities and colleges. His awards include the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Woodrow Wilson Award for Distinguished Service, and the Boston College Alumni Achievement Award. And topping it all off, he's a lifelong member of the Red Sox Nation and a huge baseball fan, apparently. We're going to have a Q&A at the conclusion of the talk, and Josh and staff will be passing around some cards. So I'd ask you, if the thought comes to you, jot it down, and then we'll collect them up, and then we'll have the Q&A from the cards so we don't have some redundancies. And then this is going to be on the record, so I hope that we'll get beyond the Rotary Club level. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Nick Burns.
John, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you for mentioning Red Sox Nation. How many people in this room are members of Red Sox Nation? I'll bet quite a few. We're in first place, I think. I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C. for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. A lot of friends in the room. It's always perilous to recognize people, but I have to, because Steve Clemons is here from the New America Foundation and the Atlantic magazine, and Steve is a one-person intellectual thought leader. He is someone who's pressing the foreign policy debate in this city, and he's made an enormous difference over the last 4 or 5 years in getting all of us to talk about these very important foreign policy challenges that we face. So I wanted to recognize Steve. I also wanted to recognize two friends from the United States Foreign Service, where I served for 27 years. Ambassador Bill Courtney is here, longtime American ambassador to Kazakhstan, to Georgia, one of our great experts on the former Soviet Union. And Ambassador Liz McCune is here. And Liz and I served together with Liz's husband Ken in Egypt in the early 1980s, and Liz was an ambassador for us in Oman as well in the Middle East. So I'm really grateful that both of them are here. I'm sorry you have to sit through these set of remarks by me. And finally I wanted to mention Laurie Murray, who is the Executive Director of the World Affairs Councils of the United States, and that gets to the mission of the World Affairs Council in our country. We need to be speaking about international challenges in our country, and this is the principal pan-American organization throughout the country that unites all the World Affairs Councils in cities, big cities like Washington and smaller cities. And if there is ever a time when, as the leading global power, we as citizens needed to focus in our communities on what the global challenges of the 21st century have in store for us, it's through the World Affairs Council. So Laurie's organization unites all these World Affairs Council and tries to get our kids focused through scholarship programs, educational programs on foreign affairs, and get all of us thinking and talking about them. So I wanted to recognize Laurie and her mandate that she's taken on for the World Affairs Councils of the United States of America. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to the question and answer, and I know it's going to be on paper, but I really hope that you'll let me know if you disagree with anything I say. You should feel free to disagree. If you have any questions about U.S. policy in the Middle East, let's have a good discussion through your questions when I finish my relatively brief remarks, because I look forward to that. That's always the best part of these engagements. I've been asked to speak about the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, as a lot of people are calling it, and its implications for the United States. And I think we have to look at the response of the Obama administration and assess whether or not the response has been positive, whether it's been capable. I think it has been. But I'd like to start with a broader point. What is the environment in which these extraordinary developments in the Arab world over the last 6 months have taken place? What's the international environment at this time? I think we meet at the most challenging time for the United States on the international agenda for any administration since President Franklin Delano Roosevelt took his oath of office in his 3rd term in early 1941, on the eve of the Second World War, of that unbelievable two-front war, 16 million Americans in uniform between 1941 and 45. Since the Civil War, the greatest test we've ever faced. I think this time, the agenda that President Obama inherited when he took the oath of office in January 2009 is the most challenging time for our country since 1941. Why do I think that? Reflect on what is in his inbox every morning as he makes that commute from the 2nd floor of the White House through the Rose Garden into the Oval Office. The greatest and most serious and most debilitating global recession in 70 years. And a recession that has not ended because we're at 9% unemployment. And because we still have millions of people without work, particularly our young people, and because we have millions of people losing their homes to foreclosure, and because of the lack of economic confidence in this country. If that was the only problem that the president had, That'd be enough to fill one term of office with the administration working flat out 100% on that issue alone. And that's very much an international issue, because part of the response to the global economic crisis is, can the president work effectively with China and the European Union and Brazil and India and Mexico, the other economic power centers of the world, to stabilize on a macroeconomic basis the global economy? I think he's done very well on that, but it's not the only challenge that we face, because beyond the global recession, we're fighting 2.5 wars. And with the sole exception of the two-front war in the Second World War, we've never in American history had to fight 2 major land wars simultaneously. 150,000 American troops in Iraq when the president took office. Now 108,000 American troops in Afghanistan. The president's announcement last night would have 30,000 troops come out in the next 12 months. But still, those 2 engagements alone, and now with, I'll call the half war, the war in Libya, where the United States and its NATO allies are fighting through an air campaign we've never in American history, with the exception of the Second World War, had to undertake such an extraordinary and difficult military mission on behalf of our country. Beyond the recession and the 2.5 wars, 2 countries, Iran and North Korea, in the 2 most vital regions of the world to us, the Middle East and East Asia, trying to become nuclear weapons powers, trying to upset the balance of power in both regions, trying to reduce the power of the United States and our friends and allies in Asia and the Middle East. Both of them crises inherited by this administration, both of them crises that President Clinton and President Bush also had to deal with. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg of this extraordinary moment that we're at internationally, because the heart of the international agenda, and certainly this was true in the last 10 years of my diplomatic career, the heart are these transnational issues, the challenges to us that are flowing under our borders, over our borders, and right through them. The challenges that mean that we can never again be isolationist, and certainly can't be unilateralist when we are dealing with climate change, or trafficking of women and children, or terrorism, or the juxtaposition of terrorism with nuclear, chemical, and biological weaponry, the nightmare scenario, or pandemics, or crime and drug cartels. This is an extraordinarily complex agenda. It's the heart of the problems that we face, and we need a globally oriented country to face them. That speaks to the mission of the World Affairs Councils, and it speaks to the responsibility that all of us have. So we meet today, I think, at the most difficult, most complex time that we've ever faced in our lifetimes, and the most dangerous. Think about 9/11. We're just about to commemorate the loss of 3,000 people on September 11th, 2001, the 10th anniversary, this coming September. How did Al-Qaeda kill 3,000 people? They used the most crude means available. They flew airplanes into buildings in New York, in Washington, D.C., into a field in Pennsylvania. And it was the collision, it was the impact, it was the fire, the explosions that killed the people. The challenge for us is to think about what would happen any day going forward if terrorist groups use chemical weapons, or biological weapons, or nuclear suitcase bomb technology in a terrorist attack in Midtown Manhattan, or Washington, or Wichita, Kansas, or Olympia, Washington. They would kill multiples of 3,000 people using chemical, biological, and nuclear weaponry. That's the stakes. Those are the stakes that the United States faces. That's why we need vigorous, visionary presidential leadership. That's why we've all got to be engaged in the world, not isolated from it, not pulling in the drawbridge, saying our problems are too severe here at home, we can't afford financially or psychically to be committed as a global superpower. We don't have the choice in a highly integrated, globalized 21st century to withdraw from the world as maybe 18th century Americans, who were often quite isolationist, might have wanted to do. I think this is the environment that the president inherited in 2009. And this is the environment in which the Arab awakening has taken place. I don't think you can understand the events in the Middle East or put them into perspective without this framework of what else we have to do in the world. How about the Arab awakening? How should we understand it? And how should we understand the American response to it? I think, first of all, one thing to understand is abundantly clear to me 6 months into this crisis, and a set of crises, but also a time of opportunity, perhaps for the Arab peoples to build democracies in the Arab world, is we may be witnessing the end of the first act of a 5-act play that might go on for years or even decades. In the prospect of building a democracy in Egypt or in Libya or in Tunisia, or even getting the opportunity for women to drive in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately is a generational prospect. Ambassador Liz McCune served in the Arab world. She understands that change is going to come not as quickly as we Americans would want to see, or as the Arab peoples might want to see. So I think we can maybe take a snapshot on June 23rd, June 24th, 2011, of what's happened with the Arab awakening, but it's just a snapshot at the end of Act 1. This drama might not be finished for years to come. That's one way to understand it. How has President Obama done? How might we assess his performance in reacting to these events and in leading the American response? I think he's done very well. And I think for the most part, if you look at the 22 Arab countries, all in a process of revolution, transition, change, I think the President has been a very capable manager of American interests in reacting to some of the most difficult decisions that an American president has had to make. The decision, do you stay with Hosni Mubarak or not? The decision, do you go into Libya or not? The decision, how do you react to our friend, the government of Bahrain, when it does things that we don't like and care for in reacting to demonstrators in Pearl Square? I think on Egypt, President Obama made the right decision that at some point at the end of January of this year, President Mubarak had lost control of the streets and the respect of the young people in the streets and lost control of his government. I know the conventional wisdom is the president didn't act quickly enough, the critics say, to make the change from Mubarak to supporting the demonstrators. I thought he got it just about right. Hosni Mubarak was a 30-year ally of the United States of America and a very good friend of the United States, and we depended on him. And to have deserted him, say, on January 25th or 6th or 7th would have been folly and would have been unwise. But it was abundantly clear a week, 10 days later, and these events moved at warp speed, that we had to make a change. And I think the president, as a very good diplomat, was able to do that rather quietly, working behind the scenes, trying not to humiliate a friend, but trying to coax a friend to leave power peacefully, as President Mubarak, to a large extent, did. How about on Libya? This may sound contradictory, but I think that the president was right to be skeptical, but he was also right to have us go in. Let me explain that. We don't have vital interests in Libya. If you look at the region, we have vital interests in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and in Yemen. We can't say that we have vital political, military, economic interests in Libya. And so the initial skepticism of Secretary Gates and of the president that perhaps this was a fight we shouldn't take on, I thought was wise and well-grounded. But what happened after that, after they voiced that skepticism? Our two closest allies in the world, France and Britain, came to us and said, this is actually vital to us. And we think that our interests are on the line, and you're in NATO with us, and we'd like you to think about that. And then the Arab League said, unbelievably and ironically, please intervene, the United States of America, in the internal affairs of one of our member states. They'd never said that before in the history of the Arab League. Please intervene and oppose Muammar Gaddafi and protect the people in Tripoli and in Benghazi. And then as this week sped, this all happened in the space of 4 or 5 days, as this week sped along, there was the imminent siege of Benghazi. Gaddafi was on the offensive. The rebels were in retreat. Benghazi was going to be overrun. And based on the statements of Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi and Muammar Gaddafi himself and their actions as their tanks and APCs rolled eastward, there was every reason to believe that there would have been a bloodbath in Benghazi. So I think the president was right to be skeptical, but he was right at the last minute to say, we have to go in to avoid a bloodbath, a humanitarian catastrophe. The Arab League wants us to go in. The Security Council was going to bless the operation, right to go in. On the Gulf, and here's where you see the tensions and the balance that the president has had to engage in. Was the president right not to intervene militarily in Bahrain or Yemen or Syria? I would say yes. We have a completely different set of interests in the Gulf in terms of the economy and counterterrorism and our military interests than we do in North Africa and the Levant. This is a wide, complex region. And there are many elements that unite the Arab world, but there are more that are specific to each country. And so I've appeared in a lot of interview shows over the last couple of months where the proverbial question is, but isn't the United States being inconsistent or even hypocritical by intervening in Libya or intervening politically in Egypt, but not intervening in Bahrain or Yemen or Syria? And my answer is no. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy towards the Middle East, a vast region that is so complex and so different from Morocco all the way to Iraq. And given the profound interest we have in the Gulf, I think the priority we've placed on stability and on protecting our military and economic interests is correct. It's sometimes painful to make these choices, and it's certainly difficult, but I think that balance is important. I think the president has got that balance well in hand. What are the major challenges as we look ahead? If that's my assessment, quite simplistic, quite brief, and I'd be happy to talk about it with any of you, how might we think about the challenges? Because if we're at the end of Act 1, the challenges will keep coming at us for the next several years. Let me begin with Libya. I think that we're at a point of stalemate in Libya. Gaddafi hasn't won, but he hasn't lost. The rebels have been vigorous, relatively more united now than they were 2 or 3 months ago, relatively more capable, but certainly not strong enough to push him out. Everything is going to depend on NATO, on the ability of NATO to focus offensive air power critically, sharply, persuasively to convince Gaddafi to leave power, or convince someone from within his inner circle to tell him that his time is up, which is another scenario for how this conflict might end. Can NATO do that? One of the responsibilities I had in government was to be U.S. ambassador to NATO between 2001 and 2005, during 9/11, and during our entry into the Iraq and Afghan wars. I believe in the alliance. I believe the United States must lead the alliance. I have been sorely disappointed in the performance of the alliance. Because here we have 28 countries, and you know our mantra in NATO is all for one and one for all. We're supposed to be operating together. This is really a British, French, Danish, Norwegian, Belgian, and American military offensive. Because Germany is sitting it out. Not just sitting it out, and Germany is the keystone country in Europe, the largest European member of the alliance. Germany did not even vote in the Security Council for the mission. And Germany has not helped and has not added its extensive firepower to this effort. And the Italians and the Spaniards have not done what they should have done to help us. So you have, in effect, NATO with one arm tied behind its back, trying to do something very difficult. We're not there on the ground. We're trying to use tactical air power and, frankly, intimidation to convince Gaddafi to stand down. Difficult to do that when leading members of the NATO alliance are publicly criticizing President Obama, President Sarkozy, and Prime Minister Cameron from the sidelines. So we have a stalemate. And I think it's up to NATO to unify itself. It's up to the critical members of the alliance on the sidelines carping to at least stop the criticism and support the military mission that the NATO alliance decided on and the Security Council have blessed. I also think something else. It's difficult for me to look at this operation in Libya and to see how it's being talked about and articulated publicly. The United States is in reserve and NATO is in the lead. I don't recognize that construct. The United States is NATO. The United States is the leading member of NATO. If this operation is worthy of NATO support, the United States should lead the mission, and the United States should be in the forefront. NATO has always been, since April 1949, an unequal alliance. There's always been one country Now, I think 70% or 60 to 70% of the defense spending in the alliance is American. In every war we fought, in the Cold War, we stood up against the Soviet Union because of American military power. In Bosnia and Kosovo, the Americans led. In Afghanistan, the Americans have led NATO. How can NATO succeed if the largest member is not on the front lines? I know it's a very unpopular thing to say, because I know that the great bulk of our political leaders don't want us to be there, and they're not giving President Obama support for the mission. Some say it's unconstitutional because of war powers. Others say we're too busy, or we don't have enough money. But if we're the leader of the alliance and we're not leading, I think it's a fundamental problem for the NATO alliance. So that's my comment on Libya. What are the other challenges ahead? Here's one way to think about this pan-Arab drama. It's all about Egypt, I would say. It's all about Egypt. Whether or not some of the Arab countries, it won't be all of them, can begin to build at the grassroots level the foundations of democracy, political institutions, civil society, world affairs councils, whether they can begin to have a pluralistic political system and not authoritarian ones, is going to depend on the keystone state in the Arab world. 85 million Egyptians, heart and soul, culturally, politically, historically, of the Arab world. And tremendously capable people. You saw that in Tahrir Square. I think the most inspiring moment of the last 6 months were those young kids in Tahrir Square, peacefully demonstrating for hope, for a future of promise, for jobs, and for a voice in their society that they haven't had in their entire lives. We have to support them. And again, I thought the president was right to throw his support to them, as he did on Friday night, January 28th, in his statement that he made. That was the first indication he was going to switch from Mubarak to the young people in the streets. If those young people and the military and political parties can begin to build a political system that's not one-dimensional, can begin to write a constitution that will be pluralistic and democratic, the Egyptian people have a chance. But they're going to need a lot of help. They're going to need economic help and trade preferences and investment and capital and political encouragement. And again, I see the United States stepping out to do that. Where's the rest of the Arab world? Isn't it in the interest of the rich Gulf kingdoms to support democracy in Egypt, because they may not want to see jihadism in Egypt in the future, or a one-dimensional Muslim Brotherhood domination of Egyptian politics in the future. I think it is in the interest of those countries to see a pluralistic Egypt develop. I think it's certainly in the interest of Europe, of India, of Japan. We've not seen the international engagement in Egypt that we should. I think this drama, this play in 5 acts, will revolve around what happens in Egypt. And we need to be front and center with our own assistance to help the Egyptian people. Another point is that as the region transforms, we've got to transform with it. And a number of us in this room have been involved for many years in U.S. policy towards the Middle East. We obviously weren't always right in our assessments of what was happening in the Arab world. Maybe we gave too much and too unstinting support to authoritarian regimes in the past. We've had a policy towards the Middle East that was based on stability and a military engagement. And there clearly needs to be a transition to include a military engagement, but to engage politically, to assert that we'll support democratic development, to engage on a people-to-people basis with the Arab peoples, not just with the regimes of the Arab world. So obviously what we've got to do as Americans, through our national debate, is to say, we made some mistakes in the past. We can't assume that American policy continues unchanged when everything is changing in the Middle East. I don't think we've seen enough willingness on the part of all of us to stand up and recognize the mistakes we made and recognize the changes we now need to make to support them. A third thought in the future would be this. We've got to seize this moment to try to push the Israelis and Palestinians towards peace and towards a two-state solution. It's about the most difficult thing we have to do in the world. because we're now 63 years past the creation of the State of Israel, and the Israelis haven't had a single day of security in those 63 years. 63 years past the dispersal of the Palestinians from homes, their homes, in places like Jaffa and in Haifa and other parts of now the State of Israel, and they haven't had a single day of justice in 63 years. The only country that can effectively mediate a peace treaty between them is the United States of America. And if you look at this coldly and analytically and objectively, this is not a great moment for peace. The Palestinians are still divided. Prime Minister Netanyahu has a coalition that does not seem to be interested in true negotiations with the Palestinians. It seems to be the last time that you'd choose to march forward to try to bring them together. But if we don't try, and I applaud the administration for sending out a team of negotiators last week, Dennis Ross and David Hale, if we don't assert that peace is an imperative, it won't happen without American leadership. And so I think it has to be a priority, no matter how unpopular it may seem or difficult it may seem, for the United States to continue to be seized by that issue. Finally, two other factors and two other challenges that might guide us in the future, in addition to the ones that I've mentioned about Libya, about Egypt, about recognizing our mistakes and changing a bit of how we relate to people in the Arab world, and about the peace process. We can't forget about a country called the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think if you'd asked any of us on January 1st, 2011, what's the greatest challenge in the Middle East, we all would have said, 100% of us, Iran. And that problem has been obscured by all of our attention on Tunisia, and Libya, and Egypt, and Syria since the middle part of January. But that Iranian threat to the Arab world, to Israel, and to the U.S. remains. Iran's the leading supporter of terrorist groups in the Middle East and funder of those groups. Iran is seeking a nuclear weapons capability. Iran has been our biggest problem in Iraq and Afghanistan, and supporting the terrorist groups that have gone after our troops in both places. So this is a threat that we have to deal with. And when the attention from the dramas in the Arab world begins to subside, Iran will be there. I think it's probably the most serious security challenge globally that we face. So what do we do about Iran? Frankly, I think there's some good news here. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad probably hit his high point of regional influence sometime in 2007 or 8. He had a significant following in the Arab Street. He was tweaking and jousting with the United States, with the Bush administration in which I served, and with President Obama when he came in, and sometimes scoring some points off us publicly. What's happened since then? Well, this revolt in the Middle East didn't just start in Tunisia on January 14th, 2011. It actually started in June of 2009 in Tehran, when Ahmadinejad stole the Iranian elections from the people of Iran. And it was the millions of people who went into the streets in Iran who I think provided some encouragement and an example for the Arabs a year and a half later. Though we know that Iran is a complicated place, we know that there are millions of Iranians who hate their own government and want to see it disappear. I think that the mullahs in Iran and Ahmadinejad have got to be really worried about what they're witnessing. Their great friend Bashar al-Assad is on the ropes in Syria, mercifully and thankfully under attack by his own people because of the 40-year record of brutality of he and his father. And if Iran loses that ally, and I hope that the Syrian regime will fall, Iran will be much less capable of being influential through its proxies, Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, to make trouble in Lebanon or the Palestinian territories or Israel or Jordan in the future. The Iranians have got to be worried about the example of people taking events into their own hands, as the Arab peoples seem to be doing. That could happen in Iran. I also think that we've got a healthier debate about Iran in our own country. When I was in office responsible for Iran in the State Department, I heard the drumbeats for war on the editorial pages of some of our newspapers, from some of our think tanks, not some of the ones represented here today maybe, but others, and some of our leading politicians, that we had to think about offensive military operations against Iran. You don't hear that much anymore because they're weaker, they're more isolated, we're much stronger than they are. And it may be that what's emerging in our country is a consensus that the way to handle Iran is through a policy of toughness, strength, leaving the military option on the table, but thinking of this as a long-term struggle to contain Iran through the buildup of our conventional military support to the Gulf partners of the United States, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and other countries, through our own continued military presence in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And if we can effectively surround Iran with U.S. partners and allies and with the power of the United States military, I don't believe Iran is going to have the capability of disrupting the balance of power the way it would like to do. And we can wait for the collapse of that despicable regime, as we waited in the Cold War for the collapse of Stalin's Soviet Union and the East Bloc countries when they all collapsed between 1989 and 1991. To me, establishing a policy of containment is a lot smarter, more in the tradition of our Republican and Democratic leaders of the post-war, Eisenhower and Truman and Reagan, than just starting a fourth war, if you will, in the Middle East, when we don't have to do that. I think the agenda is moving towards this policy of containment, and I think it's very healthy that we're moving in that direction. Last point, how do we appreciate the Arab Spring and deal with it as Americans? We're going to have a very complex, rather sophisticated balancing act as we react to Egypt versus Yemen versus Syria versus Bahrain. I told my students in my class at the Kennedy School, we talked about this in nearly every class, as the Arab awakening progressed throughout the spring. I kind of pictured President Obama, my image of him was inside a stadium, up on a high wire without a net, balancing these competing American objectives. We are Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. And so we have to support democracy and freedom and pluralism. But we're also a country with military and economic and concrete interests in countries that are authoritarian by nature and will probably stay so for some time to come. So we're balancing these competing interests. And I think the President's insight, as I've just watched him, and the insight of Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates has been, we cannot possibly have one policy that we rigidly adhere to for 22 countries. And they've been criticized for this. But I think it's smart and wise to understand that if there's an opportunity that the people of the region themselves give us in Egypt or Tunisia or Libya to help them change, we must take it to support democracy or a future of democracy. But in the face of Iran, in the face of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in the face of our decades-long military interests in the Gulf, we cannot forsake our friends in Saudi Arabia, or in Bahrain, or in Yemen, or in Kuwait, or the UAE, on the sake of a promise. And so we have to react differently to the crises as they unfold. That may sound contradictory. Some people may say it sounds hypocritical. You act in one place differently than another. But in a complex, richly varied Arab world, I think it's the only way to proceed, to achieve this balance, which will change over time from crisis to crisis. And I think the President has achieved that balance for us. So that will be the most difficult thing for us to do and to retain support for in our own country to do as we move forward. Those are my thoughts, at least some of my thoughts, on what we should do in this very exciting, historic time as we think about the American position in the Middle East. I'm happy to talk about any of these issues. Happy to receive any of the questions. If there are no questions, we'll just do what we do in universities. We'll just start calling on people and ask you what you think. So thank you for listening to me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I've got about half the questions here, Mr. Ambassador, so I think we've got until about 1700 today. Hopefully, there'll be a couple in here you can.
And hopefully I'll be able to read them.
You can pick through.
Okay.
I can probably do the reading.
Okay, that'd be great.
But I don't want to be the guy that picks them.
I'll
We
have
should have
to do it.
rehearsed this one.
We should. It's okay.
But this one is from a very erudite person I know. I agree a one-size-fits-all foreign policy doesn't work, but how do you differentiate Libya and Syria in order to arrive at such a different approach? Is it simply the potential reaction from Iran to a U.S. NATO operation in Syria?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So the question is, how do we understand the very different way that the U.S. has acted in Libya? We intervene militarily, versus Syria, where we have not. Given the fact that they're both authoritarian, they're both brutal regimes, they both should disappear. And here's my answer. As I said before, despite the President's correct initial skepticism, a confluence of factors emerged. The Arab League invitation, the Security Council blessing, and the imminent siege of Benghazi that required us to go in. Let's say the United States had not gone into Libya, that we'd blocked that Security Council resolution, that Britain and France wouldn't have had the capacity that they needed from us to take out the air defense system of Libya on that weekend. There could have been, I think likely would have been, a tremendous number of casualties of people dead because of the marauding Gaddafi forces. That would have been laid at the doorstep of the United States. We're the global superpower. We had the capacity to prevent it. The President did. How about Syria? There is no consensus in the Security Council or the Arab League that the United States or Britain or France should be in Syria militarily. We would have had no support, no Security Council resolution, and the active opposition of Russia and China. A completely different equation. And Syria is a completely different country than Libya, for all of you who have been in both places. Syria, densely populated. Syria, we're walking into a drama that's underway for 3 or 4 decades where people are rising up in city after city and town after town to oppose a brutal government. How do you make a military difference there? And what would be the point of application of our power there? I think we're better off isolating, sanctioning, turning the rest of the world against Syria, and encouraging the Syrian people to continue their campaign to oust their regime. I don't see a contradiction here. I think it's good decision-making by the President in both cases.
Excellent. Why have countries like Germany, Italy, and Spain not given their support to NATO?
Why have Germany, Italy, and Spain not supported the NATO mission in Libya? The problem that NATO has right now is that one of the problems, is that the largest country in Europe, Germany, 80 million people, far stronger and wealthier than anybody else in Europe, has essentially decided that it's not going to believe in the use of force when the use of force is justified. What's happened in Afghanistan? Germany voted for the NATO mission in Afghanistan in 2003. I was the American ambassador at that table when we made the decision to go in. We got to Afghanistan in August 2003, NATO, following the U.S. military intervention there of October 2001. And the American troops went to the south and east, which is where 95% of the fighting was. It's where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda really had an impact, in Kandahar and Oruzgan and Helmand provinces along the Pak-Afghan border. Who went there? The United States of America and Canada and Britain and Denmark and the Baltic countries and the Dutch, the Netherlands. Who didn't go? Germany went north, Italy went west, Spain stayed in the middle in Kabul. They refused to deploy their troops over the last 8 years to help our troops. So here you have this extraordinary 8-year war. In a normal war, the Supreme Allied Commander governing all NATO would say, the threat is more in the east and south. We're going to deploy more troops from the north and west to the east and south, and Germany and Italy and Spain have refused to go into the places where the combat has been most intense. You've just seen a replication of that in Libya over the last couple of months. The same scenario has played out. Germany, a country we all greatly admire and respect for its huge economic successes, for its leadership role in the Euro crisis, has become, in a way, semi-isolationist in terms of its global power. It conceives of itself as a regional country, but not global. The problem with that approach in the 21st century is you can't have security in Europe if you have a crisis just to the south of Europe across the Mediterranean and North Africa, or in the Levant, or even in places in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan. And so NATO is fundamentally divided. between those who believe that NATO is the NATO of the 50s and 60s. You know, we stand and fight along the old lines of the Cold War, and those of us, like President Bush and President Obama, who believe that NATO is the organization that's got to be in Central Asia and South Asia and North Africa and the Levant and the Gulf, because that's where the security challenges are. And so there's been a profound ideological split in NATO for the better part of the last 10 years on this. We've just seen it play out now in Libya and Afghanistan to our detriment. And unfortunately, our soldiers pay the price. Our soldiers take the brunt of the conflict. And you can understand then how the American people, members of Congress, would react to Libya and say, well, why aren't other countries doing more? They should do more.
This one has some subtleties to it. Many of them do. If the Palestinian parties, a big if, can remain unified long enough to bring the proposal for a Palestinian state to the UN in September, what do you think would be the effect of a U.S. veto in view of the changes with the Middle East, particularly in Egypt?
Well, that's a tough question. So the question is, if the Palestinian parties Hamas and Fatah, can become united, and if they can form a unitary government, if they can then bring this proposal for a resolution for a Palestinian state to the UN, what would be the effect of American veto? I think it would be unfortunate. And I know there are a lot of people who disagree with me, but both President Bush and President Obama have correctly put the United States on the line to support a Palestinian state and to support a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. If the biggest symbolic act that the international community takes in a generation turns out to be a vote in New York, I sure hope we can avoid the United States being the country that vetoes it, because the Palestinian people deserve statehood, and the Israeli people deserve security, and they need a mediator that is able to speak to both sides. And so if, I certainly understand the position of Prime Minister Netanyahu on this issue and why this is not in Israel's interest. And so I would hope that if we're not prepared to support it, I would hope the vote could be avoided. How could you manage that? Through diplomacy. Through enough progress in the Israeli-Palestinian talks, or at least the talks about the talks, that we could say to the rest of the international community, you know, it wouldn't be helpful to have the vote, to schedule it in September, because you're just going to weaken the process. You're going to divide the two from each other. That's the argument we need to make. But for us to veto, I hope we're not in the position we have to do that, because we ought to be able to support, obviously, security for Israel and a secure future for Israel, but also an independent state for the Palestinians. So that's a diplomatic challenge for the Obama administration that has not yet been resolved. And we'll have to watch and see what happens this summer.
What can the U.S. government do to support democracy movements in the Middle East, North Africa region that we aren't currently doing? And I think you addressed it in pretty good length, but maybe you've got a few additional.
What can the United States do to support democracy and civil society in Egypt and
We've got about 5 questions.
elsewhere in the Middle East? Here I think our Secretary of State, someone I greatly admire, is really well placed, and she's playing this role, to play this role. She came into office saying, international politics and American foreign policy is more than just war and peace. It's more than just national security as we traditionally understand it. It's about development. It's about women's rights. It's about grassroots change. And I saw her put this into practice when she first went to India in the summer of 2009. She spent 2.5 days, I think, outside of Delhi. Before she had the meetings with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, she went to health clinics and development projects to make the point that the United States has to operate at the grassroots level, not just at the government-to-government level. So the real challenge for us is we've just spent 30 years interacting with Arab governments. Almost everything I did as a diplomat in the Arab world was with governments. Given the changes in Tunisia and Egypt and Jordan and Syria, we need to begin to act at the retail level and engage the people of these countries, not just their regimes. So American aid, economic aid, university exchanges, capital investment, small business development. How do you form a World Affairs Council? How do you form a public advocacy group? How do you form a League of Women's Voters? I mean, all the thousands of different civil society organizations that make up our democracy need to be created there. I don't think governments can do that as well as private organizations can. So I think the change has to be, we can't just interact with governments, we've got to interact at the people-to-people level. And I think our Secretary of State is the perfect person to lead this, and I think she is trying to reorient our policy. This is a big change for us, Governments sometimes don't change easily or quickly, but I think that the Secretary is trying to lead us in that direction.
It's an interesting one here. You spoke about Egypt as the cornerstone of success in the Arab Spring. What do you think about what many political observers have said? It started in Tunisia, and that's where it has to finish, given the high likelihood of the success of democracy in Tunisia.
Well, I spent a lot of time talking about how the Middle East is different, and it is, each 22 countries. But there's also there's a narrative that has united these 22 countries. And clearly, I don't think the young kids would have been out in Tahrir Square on January 25th if there hadn't been a very courageous person willing to object to the way he was treated in Tunisia, in Tunis, on January 14th. And so, these events have had a rolling effect. Libya's influenced Egypt, and Egypt influenced Bahrain, and Bahrain may have influenced Yemen. And even women in Saudi Arabia did very courageously step out and 40 women drive, which I thought was so wonderful last Friday. And so I think, in a sense, we've got to have retail policies for each of the 22 countries, but we have to respond to this narrative for reform and change that is sweeping throughout the region. And that's why the president, I think, was so right to stand up in late January and say, we're with the people if they're protesting peacefully, and they largely were in Pearl Square. They largely were in Tahrir Square. And Americans will always support change. If it's peaceful, if it's positive, if it's forward-looking, we've got to be behind that. So again, this gets to the balance. We've got to be a lot of things here. We've got to be in a lot of different platforms to be effective in this region.
Do you worry that a long stalemate with Gaddafi will see Brazil, China, Russia, India make peace with him and offer a backdoor out of conflict, just as U.S. rejiggered the relationship with China after Tiananmen?
Well, there may be a lot of countries that try to throw a lifeline to Gaddafi, and I don't think it's going to work. I mean, it might have worked in the first month of the Libyan crisis, but this thing has now gone on too long. And Gaddafi is more isolated. There was a Russian attempt to mediate that failed. I doubt very much that we'll see a successful mediation effort. I think that the rebels would only agree, and I imagine the US, France, and Britain would only agree to any kind of mediation that resulted in the departure of Gaddafi from the country. Gaddafi's latest line is, okay, stop the war, ceasefire, I'll organize change. That's not going to work when you have a rebel alliance in Benghazi that's strengthening every day. When you have Musa Kusa defecting and the oil minister defecting, and you have generals defecting, he's on the ropes. And he should stay on the ropes. And we should apply power to encourage him to leave, but leave the country. And then we'll see what the International Criminal Court wants to do with a leader who's responsible for massive human rights violations of his own people. So I think a lifeline to him would be the wrong policy. But obviously, stopping the fighting is what we all hope for and should act for, but in a way that stimulates the withdrawal of Gaddafi from Libya itself.
We have time for about two more. I was trying to pick, this is a pretty pithy one. Do you see an analogy between our abandonment of the Shah and our switching from Mubarak to the people in the streets of Egypt?
This is a tough question. Do I see an analogy between our abandonment, was the way it was written, of the Shah in 1978, 79 of Iran, and our abandonment of President Mubarak? I think they're qualitatively different in this sense, and I could be wrong about this, but my sense is that the revolution in Egypt was much more broad-based in Egyptian society than the student demonstrations and Khomeini-inspired Islamic demonstrations in Tehran throughout the year of 1978, leading into 1979. And the events in Egypt were decidedly more peaceful and in a way more democratic, in the way that organically Tahrir Square protesters organized themselves, than the hardline Khomeini agenda, which was quite violent. Of 1978 and 79. So I guess I don't see I don't see the similarities. I see a lot of differences. Time has marched on, and we're in a different place in 2011 than we certainly were back in the Carter administration. in the 70s when most of us were in graduate school or college or grammar school in this audience.
I think this one sort of puts everything in perspective, and it's a good way to probably close unless we have some really burning one. How can the Arab Muslim allies of the U.S. more effectively contribute to stability, economic, social, and governance, and peace during the Arab awakening?
This is a really great question. As I understood the question, how can the Arab regimes of the Gulf,
Allies and friends.
allies and friends, respond to the challenges in
And
Egypt,
contribute to stability.
to stability in places like Egypt? You all know that one of the great problems we've had, and I've not mentioned it till now, I should have, is that the Saudi and Emirati regimes, others were very opposed to what the United States did in in supporting the protesters in Egypt and Tunisia, in supporting the withdrawal of Ben Ali and Mubarak from Tunisian Egyptian politics. And I don't think that disappointment and anger from the Gulf regimes has lapsed. They haven't gotten over it. But they need to get over it. And there may be an impulse in some places in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Kuwait that says, well, we cannot support democracy in Tunisia and Egypt because we don't want democracy to come to our countries, because we want to maintain our own political system. That would be decidedly short-sighted. Because if you don't have stability and hope and a possibility of economic prosperity in Egypt and Tunisia and in Libya, then I think that almost guarantees there'll be further trouble in the Gulf as this revolution sweeps from one part of the Arab world to another. So in essence, John, we need to appeal to the self-interest of the wealthy leaders of the more stable countries of the Gulf to say, don't let Egypt be run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Don't let Gaddafi be replaced by just another dictator. But actually put your support behind economic development and political change, because while you may not see that as the future of Saudi Arabia, the Egyptian people certainly see that as their future. And it may be the only way to stabilize Egypt. I think that you can make that argument. We need to make it to them, and it's a great way to end this session. I want to thank you, John, for sponsoring this, and I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Washington for hosting me, and thank all of you for your questions. I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you very much.
On behalf of this council and, of course, all the councils, and actually on behalf of all America, we thank you very much for your work for our great country. And I'm going to give you some airplane reading, because some of these are very, very good, and you might want to use them to spark your thoughts. So anyway, thanks to everyone, and I hope to see you at the next council event.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.